All right, everybody. Welcome back to the Off-Grid Urbanist podcast. Trying a little bit of a different format. I usually like to use stream of consciousness and have a new job, so that's why I've been kind of away and busy. But last summer, I recorded a lot of videos while I rafted into my photography job. But I am an engineer, and I'm doing more engineering work. So I kind of want to find something else to kind of fill the background while I talk about stuff. And in the future, I might do it on hikes or I tried to do it while riding my motorcycle around, but I do not have the microphone set up to work with road noise. So because of that, I'm trying something different. And this is a game I really like called Railroads Online, and it's very pertinent to some of the stuff on my channel because, again, kind of a bit of a train nerd. Love trains my entire life pretty much, and also love steam engines. I actually have multiple live steam engines and boilers that I use, and this game in particular is all about the narrow gauge, specifically a lot of the narrow gauge that was in Colorado, which is something very near and dear to my heart. Thing I really like about Colorado narrow gauge and narrow gauge in general is that it's kind of like the closest we ever got to realistic steampunk without being cringy. So, as someone who likes a bunch of historical steam locomotives like the one you see here, this is the Mason Bogie. This is as close as you can get to steampunk while actually being real and useful compared to just hot gluing cogs on a top hat, which is what a lot of steampunk is. It's like, no. I run steam engines that actually are dangerous, that produce boiler pressure, and you got to know what you're doing versus, just dressing up in a trench coat and some hot glued steam cogs. I don't know, but yeah, steampunk is cool as an aesthetic, but it's cooler when it's actually matched with function. So I like it when the steam powered machine actually does something. So this is the 10 Mile was just the name of one of these locomotives. It's called the Mason Bogie, the 266. A little bit of a glitch in this game. Before you get moving, things don't really line up. But yeah, I'm just thinking about using this format as a way to talk about things that are relevant in the transit sphere. So without further ado, let's see if we can let's see if we can take these cars down to the dredge, which is much lower in the valley. Looks like we have no fuel right now. When did that happen? We might have enough to get going, a little bit of steam pressure left over. So we'll see. But one of the things I wanted to talk about today, which is kind of the topic for this podcast, is the electrification of the Class 1 mainline railroads in the U.S. and kind of a scheme to do it. Because most developed countries in this world do have much more mainline electrification than we do. Our rail infrastructure is highly dependent on diesel. One of the types of rail infrastructure in this country that is the least dependent on diesel is actually a lot of our passenger services. Everything from something like the Northeast Corridor to RTD up in Denver. They made the proactive decision a long time ago to electrify pretty much all of their rail services, which is very impressive because it cuts down on overall operating costs because electricity is a lot cheaper than diesel. And also improves reliability of the actual locomotives because there's an electric locomotive compared to a diesel locomotive. There's a lot more points of failure in a diesel locomotive, and compared to a steam engine, way less complexity. And the funny thing is that we really figured out, electric locomotives before we figured out diesel locomotives. If you look back in the histories, first all railroads were powered by steam. And then they were all powered by, or not all, but then you had some electric light railroads, especially for long tunnels. That was like one of the first applications where you'd have a steam train that then would hand off its consist to an electric locomotive that would pull it through a long tunnel. And I'm not sure if the steam locomotive doused their fire or put the dampers on and they pulled that through. There was another steam locomotive waiting on the other side. But even the Pennsy, the Pennsylvania Railroad, the standard railroad of the world, lots of electrification with their GG1s. And then you had other stuff like the Milwaukee Road that was highly electrified. But for some reason in the US, we seem to have forgotten about that. And in the case of the Milwaukee Road, we bothered to spend all the money to electrify it only for the new operators. I believe BNSF now has authority over that, to tear it all down and throw everything back to diesels. And I think that happened in there's a brief period of time in like the 1960s, early 1970s, where like diesel became cheaper for like a minute, cheaper than electricity. And like, shit, let's, sorry about that, but let's just tear it all down, because now diesel's cheaper. Diesel will be cheap forever. Oh, and then the 1970s fuel crisis. I bet they felt silly. Yes, I always find it hilarious that, you have a nice infrastructure project, and then the moment the cheap fuel becomes a little bit cheaper, scrap all that invested money. It's the oil companies will certainly always provide us with the cheapest possible energy to run our equipment that requires no foresight. So it is kind of embarrassing that the US has a diesel-dependent rail network for all of the Class 1s, which Class 1s are Union Pacific, Norfolk Southern, CSX, and BNSF. And the classic argument that they throw against you is it costs too much. To electrify the entire system is just too expensive. And I've always had a bit of an issue with that. It's like, why are you insisting on electrifying the entire system? You can do partial electrification, like say the Transcon, something that has very frequent trains, very long, heavy trains. Like, how about you electrify that? And just that, you don't have to electrify every branch line. You don't have to electrify every freight yard. You just need to do partial electrification, which would be great. But even then, they're like, no, it's still too much. I mean, it doesn't make financial sense for us to even electrify high priority corridors. Even if you make the argument like this will reduce your overall maintenance, this will reduce your operating costs, it'll improve reliability. No, that all falls on deaf ears. So partial electrification, like say anything between 10 and 20% of the total US trackage, is out of the question. Could we go lower and still make an argument? And that's one of the reasons why I'm playing this game here, because the narrow gauge railroads were notorious for tight curves and steep grades. That's one of the reasons why you have a locomotive like this only pulling 2 cars. I mean, yes, this locomotive can pull more cars on flat land, and maybe up some of the grades I have on this map, you might be able to pull 4 cars instead of just 2. This is a weaker locomotive in the game. I just really like its aesthetic. We're about to start heading downhill here, which is kind of important to my argument here. So, if anyone out there has ever worked on a Class 1 railroad, especially as an engineer or conductor of a locomotive, you might recognize the old phrase, feed the monkey. Because essentially in this day and age, I'm not going to call it micromanagement, but maybe intensive data logging. Basically every action or inaction that is taken in the cab of a locomotive is recorded, and someone in corporate can see it. You could say to an extent that the Class 1s really want to run their railroads on cruise control because they're aware that diesel is expensive, and over-revving engines or having your diesel locomotive at 80 to 90% power output for a long period of time is not really a good long-term strategy. Fair enough. So you got a little bit of Big Brother looking over your shoulder, asking you, do you really need to be in that throttle setting? Do you really need to be putting that much power? If not, like, some of the computers will completely lock out higher power levels. I know there's a certain program that a lot of railroads use where they it's not derating. Derating a locomotive is something where, because it's either too hot outside, or maybe the engine gets too hot, that the computer in the engine will take like a 4,000 horsepower engine and derate it to, like, say 3,800 or 3,000. Basically, to protect the engine, it will derate itself so it doesn't allow itself to throttle up to deliver that level of power. But this is not the same as that. This is the computer that has an engine that is perfectly capable of delivering more power, the computer will not allow you to, per that section of track, per the rules that somebody in an office far away has decided to impress upon the engineers. And a lot of engineers don't really like this, because there's sometimes where, if you're coming out a hill, maybe we should get a run at it. Maybe, we should put a little bit more momentum into this train and, kind of do some classic railroading. No. Now it's almost as if you've got a speed limit recommendation that is enforceable by a digital servant, or at least your power level. Needless to say, the point I'm getting at is that essentially the throttle the throttle position and power output of a locomotive is logged and geotagged for the most part for every single mile of mainline railroad. I'm not sure if it's uploaded in real time or if it's logged on the locomotive locally that some corporate hack can access later to see if an engineer is bypassing the computer somehow, which I doubt they could do, or burning unnecessary fuel, because how dare you burn company diesel? So my thought is that, well, there's definitely there's certain locations and segments of track which are notorious for having your locomotive in a high throttle position, or in this case, as we're going downhill, where you're really using your dynamic brakes. And dynamic brakes is basically the equivalent of regen brakes without the benefit. Diesel locomotives are essentially gigantic generators on traction motors with their bogies. That's actually why this is called a Mason bogie, because this entire portion up here articulates. So if modern engines are just gigantic generators on wheels, when they go downhill, well, usually the engine backs off. But now your traction motors turn into essentially generators, whether it's an AC or DC setup, and they produce voltage that then is burned off in a massive resistor bank in the back of the locomotive. So you're taking all that precious potential energy as you go downhill, and you're converting it into heat. So a bit of a waste, but that's what dynamic braking is. So as much as we record the high throttle position on the ascent, you also record the high dynamic usage on the descent. And the argument I would make to corporate, the argument that I would make to the shareholders of BNSF or Union Pacific would be, okay, let's look at your map. Let's create a heat map of your entire network, and we will put the from green to red, or whatever color scale you want to use, everywhere where you are at like a 80 to 90% throttle output, or anywhere else that you are really working your brakes hard, because they're mirrored. Because I live in Colorado, we've got the Continental Divide, we have the Moffett subdivision, which climbs out of Denver up to the Moffett Tunnel, and then after it goes to the Moffett Tunnel, it starts its descent all the way down into Grand Junction. So in that case, trains go both ways. It's not that they just go one way. Trains travel east-west on the Moffett subdivision. My argument would be, how about you electrify from Denver up to the Moffett Tunnel, and then from the Moffett Tunnel down to, say, Dotsero, before it really kind of levels out in the along the Colorado River and past Eagle as you head to Glenwood Springs and Grand Junction. And similar locations like Donner Pass, other classic locations where a locomotive is working really hard to climb it and then burning off a lot of power on its descent. And the argument I would make is saying, those hours on your engine that are in the highest power bracket, when your locomotive is working in that 80 to 90% power output bracket, and even with multiple locomotives, say like you're at 70% or greater, those are the hardest running hours. That's when you're really burning the most fuel. That's when you're doing the most wear and tear. That's when the engine is getting the hottest. And as we know, heat kills everything. So what if we could eliminate the hardest working hours on your locomotives by having some electrification? And you're asking, like, okay, so we got diesel locomotives running under wires. How's that going to help? Well, this is where the concept of the dual mode locomotive comes in. As I already said, a modern diesel electric locomotive is basically a generator on wheels. So in that case, what we would do is that we would create a dual load locomotive, which basically is a regular locomotive with a pantograph on it, where you can take the equivalent of what you'd call grid power, shore power, municipal power, and use that as the power source to run those traction motors instead of your diesel engine. And it might be something where if the section of electrification, because the grade is long enough and steep enough, maybe, as soon as you get under the wires, you kill the engine. Also, some railroaders might be like, no, I want to keep my engine running. But okay, so you just take the engine out of the loop, you throttle back and idle your prime mover, and now you are running your traction motors on overhead electrification. Odds are it's going to be an overhead wire catenary system. For mainline railroads, the speeds and the difficulty of doing third rail doesn't really make sense. There are some instances in which third rail might make sense, especially if it's a tunnel with tight quarters. But odds are it would make sense to do an overhead wire. It's nice to keep all that spicy electricity up in the air away from passerbys, especially since, in America, yes, the distances are great, and there would be lots of electrification in the metaphorical middle of nowhere with no one to keep an eye on it. I'm not sure if that makes it a greater or lesser target, because typically there's greater theft and mischief in a city compared to the middle of nowhere, but in the middle of nowhere, no one's watching it if there's not a train there. But in general, that's the argument, is how can we do the smallest amount of electrification that would prevent the most fuel being burned on these steep grades and prevent the most wear and tear being done to these locomotives on these steep grades. And the added benefit is that since most hills are two-sided, on the descent, you would kick in your dynamic brake, which would now be a true regen brake, and then you'd send some of that power back into the grid. I'm sure that there's an environmental angle you could make there, but again, the shareholder argument is like, hey, typically regen is about 30% efficient. You get about 30% of the energy back. So when your train that's going through the Moffat Tunnel descends on the western side after coming out of Denver, it's possible that you can recoup 30% of the electricity that you spent on the ascent. So you're only spending 70% of the energy required to climb the hill once and then just coasting all the way down on the other side. Seems like a win-win. And this is one of those things where also it will improve reliability because, again, when are things most likely to fail? Well, it's when you're pushing them hard. So if you can find a way to, by doing selective electrification, to keep the throttle position on your locomotives fleet-wide on average below 70%, or wherever that point happens to be, then again, you might have locomotives that might be on the edge of something breaking, but they might last a little bit longer if you're just gentle with them, where you don't push them too hard. Because I am a fan, I'm an engineer, so I am a fan of kind of having stuff overbuilt and underutilized, because that's how you make it last forever. I love it when things are overbuilt. That's why I love steam engines, because these things have so much meat on them. And it is funny that the most reliable, not necessarily reliable, but definitely the most comprehensive transit we ever had was powered by steam. Once the diesels came around after World War II in the 1950s and 60s, well, at that point, the automobile was taking over, and the Federal Highways Act was really giving cars and truckers an unfair advantage they still enjoy to this day, where the railroads were expected to be private entities with little to no support, while this is why I do think in this century we are going to see trucking be reduced in its capacity and its importance. Now, trucking will always be important for the last mile, but essentially truckers have had an unfair advantage since the 1950s, where all they have to do is buy the truck, insure the truck, and fuel the truck, and pay a little bit of gas tax, but they can have their way with the national highway system and really, abuse it for their own personal gain. And it's funny, as with electric trucks rolling out that are heavier and with lighter payloads and more expensive, that now these truckers are not getting as sweet of a deal as they once had with the cheap diesel and the new road network. Now they're actually like, oh my gosh, our trucks really are doing a lot of damage to these roads. And I mean, even if it's just the U.S. taxpayer that's throwing the subsidies at highway maintenance left and right, well, those truckers are still sitting in traffic all the time, and it's a demon of their own making. I mean, yes, personal automobiles also tear up the roads, but not as much as trucks. Trucks drive more miles in a year and more tonnage miles, so much heavier trucks doing more damage per trip than a personal automobile, while also making more trips. Not to say that I'm giving personal automobiles a pass, but truckers are suffering. And this is all, these are all instances in which the freight railroads stand to gain. In Colorado, there's been recently some action up on the Steamboat Crag Northwest Rail proposal, and one of those is that there are state tax incentives for businesses to utilize rail for transport. They're trying to keep that rail line active and alive after the coal plant up in Crag shuts down, because UP might pull what they did with the Tennessee Pass, and once there's no more freight on it, they just walk away and throw the keys in the dirt. But the state does not want that rail line to become a stranded asset like the Tennessee Pass. So they're trying to keep traffic, both passenger traffic and rail freight traffic, on that line. Now, there isn't any passenger traffic right now, but that's part of the plan, is that they want to extend the ski train from Denver that goes from Denver to Winter Park. They want to extend that all the way up to Steamboat and up to Crag. And it's both a tourist train and looking at a possible commuter rail service as well, because I've worked at ski areas before. I've worked at Monarch and I've worked at Wolf Creek. It's dangerous and expensive, especially considering like when you work at a ski area, you're expected to be up there even in a blizzard. I mean, unless the pass is closed down, you're expected to show up for work, unless your supervisor says otherwise. So you're kind of taking your life in your hands every single time. And, given that these ski areas, Monarch and Wolf Creek are kind of a bit of an exception because they are kind of classic ski resorts in the sense of it's lifts on the side of a hill. What more do you want? There's no ski lodge or anything like that. There's no little village. So they are kind of in the middle of nowhere. But typically you can say that the real estate around any ski area is a bit more pricey. So no one's living right next to the thing, unless you're lucky enough to live in Garfield. So you're usually commuting in from a couple miles away, but the average is like 30 to 45 minutes in good weather, like in summer weather. So part of that, the idea with that Northwest Rail is like we can enable the ability for people who both work in, because Steamboat Springs is a much bigger operation than Monarch or Wolf Creek. They do have their little village and their lodge and restaurants and such. A lot more people are employed for that operation. In the same way with Winter Park. And the idea is like, what if we had these trains running more frequently, so that way we could allow the workforce that supports these multi-million-dollar, billion-dollar ski resorts to get into work without burning their own gas and, taking the chances on wintry. Like, I don't care how good of a winter driver you are. I'm not worried about me. I'm worried about that, minivan from Kansas or Texas that doesn't know what they're doing. That's where the danger is. And if you're a ski area employee, well, you're expected to be there, 6 days a week, 7 days a week sometimes, and just you're rolling the dice every single time. So if you had a more reliable, cheaper, more environmentally friendly and safer way to get to your job, I know, what a concept, then that will have benefits. Also now if you had rail that is, rail typically doesn't really care what the weather's doing. I mean, rain or snow, trains tend to be able to handle that a lot better than the roadways. So you could be on a train that's faster. And even if it's something where it's like the track speed isn't impressive, like 55 miles an hour, not super impressive, but in a blizzard, 55 miles an hour, especially 55 miles an hour with no stress, because, you're just riding along. You're not worried about spinning out into an embankment. Hey, that means our ski area employees can live further away from the ski resort and maybe someplace that's more affordable for them to I'm not going to say buy a house because I know what this economy looks like for younger folks working, but maybe find cheaper rent if they're a few towns away from the nice bougie ski town where they can just hop on a train and then get there. That's kind of the proposal behind the Northwest Rail. But I don't want to get too far off topic because I'll talk about the Northwest Rail in a later video or podcast, whatever you want to call it. But I really want to focus on that electrification, which that proposal I brought up is, basically taking the edge off of what you are asking of your power of your locomotives as a Class 1 railroad. So, electrifying partially electrifying the Moffett subdivision, then something like Donner Pass, or really any grade greater than 1% on the freight line railroads. And right now we're probably descending at like 2.5%, 3.5%, because again, narrow gauge was a bit wild in what they did, and that's one of the reasons I love it. Like if you look, I really like this layout that I've built, and you'll probably see more of it in future videos. But I tried to make this layout as realistic as I could, because in this game you can kind of get a bit crazy with bridges. But I try to keep my curves gentle, my grades reasonable, like keeping it below 4%, and trying to keep the track as close as possible to the ground to keep that realistic aesthetic. That way you can kind of get a bit more immersion in a game like this if you do that. And yeah, there's a bit of fill here, but it's reasonable and it's not everywhere. It's taking me a while to get to the point where I can build track this smooth. But still, I mean, it might be some rule at a Class 1 railroad. It's like, okay, anytime we get greater than 1%, put the wires up. And also with your logging, it's like anytime an engine position gets greater than 70% power output, put the wires up. So, of course, living in Colorado, my first inkling is, okay, put the wires up on the steep sections of the rail line. But also, arguably, you could justify any time that you have a large terminal, a large depot, whether it be an intermodal depot, which I know is tricky because the U.S. loves its double stacks, and that's another reason why they say, oh, we can't do electrification. We have double stacks. It's like, look in India and even Mexico. You can do electrification for double stacks. It's a taller pantograph because you got to get the wires above the containers, but it's doable. Don't say it's impossible. You can do overhead electrification with double stacks, but still, like, an example I'll pull out is Port of Los Angeles. Huge Western terminal for all of our lovely Chinese goods that we love importing, all the Chinesium crap that we like importing. And I know other things come through Los Angeles as well. And there's a lot of things exiting through Los Angeles. So in that case, even though the speeds are relatively low, I do know there's that massive viaduct through Los Angeles that a lot of trains travel through that's buried, which, again, sensible, eliminate those grade level crossings. But for a large freight terminal, maybe it makes sense to electrify a few miles out of the freight terminal to provide that oomph, that boost to get that train moving. It's like, again, you're in a position where you're getting a massive, probably 2.5 mile long freight train up to speed. Well, how about we give it a little bit of assistance? How about we boost that locomotive up with an overhead wire and take those hard hours off of that diesel prime mover? And again, if we were to have this heat map that just shows where are our locomotives working the hardest, let's try to narrow it down to that 1%, that 1 to 5% of our total rail network where our locomotives are working the hardest and doing the most damage to their prime movers, putting the hardest hours on there, and arguably burning the most fuel because you're in the highest throttle position. Let's just electrify that first 5%. And then we can, that's where, what is the smallest amount of electrification we can do that will give us the greatest tangible benefit? Which, say it's something where, all locomotives have their inspection windows, their 30-day, 60-day, 6 months, 2-year, Yeah, all locomotives by the FRA have their inspection windows. And their inspection windows, they're looking for something that broke. It doesn't say that something did break. That's where they're looking for something that broke. And if we eliminate these hard hours on these locomotives, well, maybe they pass inspection with flying colors more often than not. And maybe we postpone the massive overhauls and rebuilds that we do occasionally. And we are able to spread those out. Maybe instead of rebuilding a locomotive, every year or two, it's now you only have to rebuild the prime mover every 6 years. Not 6 years, probably 3 years. It'd be nice if we could push it out to that, because as we know, diesel engines last a long time. And if you're gentle, if you treat it well, it'll treat you well. That's kind of what I'm hitting at here. So why don't we treat our prime movers a little bit better? And because I'm also going to talk about the elephant in the room, battery electric locomotives, which most mainline freight railroads are using as a stopgap measure. America, the land of stopgap measures. We never actually fix something correctly. We just throw money at problems and hope they go away. It's not about what's the correct solution. It's about what's the easiest solution. So I know in this day and age, battery electric this, battery electric that, grid scale batteries, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I wish that we could have the discipline as a country to wait until batteries actually last a bit longer before we make all this capital investment and use all this precious lithium in silly projects. Because when it comes to grid level storage solutions, like pumped hydro is my favorite. There's also some really interesting things happening with flywheels and compressed air storage. Many people say, well, these don't have great round trip efficiency, but they also will last 50 to 100 years, if not longer. Versus the batteries, like, okay, better round trip efficiency, but within 6 or 8 years, those, pending you don't have a catastrophic battery failure with a thermal runaway, best case scenario, you're gonna lose that capacity as the electrolyte gets worn out. So with a lot of this battery electric technology, it seems like people are banking on a better battery technology being revealed in the future that is cost effective and lasts longer. And I'm not going to get into like the conspiracy of like battery companies want their batteries to fail, so you buy more batteries. I'm assuming that most of these people want to actually build good batteries, but I wouldn't put it past them. Needless to say, a lot of mainline class 1 railroads are say battery electric is the future. That's our get out of jail free card. That's how we avoid electrification. Now, to put that in perspective, most of the class 1 railroads operate fleets of thousands of or diesel electric locomotives. Thousands of them. Like 3,000 is not an unrealistic number. 3,000 to even 5,000 or 6,000 locomotives. That's a lot of locomotives. Basically, there are so many locomotives out there that the coolant that most locomotives use, diesel locomotives, is water, because that's at the scale of the number of locomotives you have. To put in antifreeze is just not I'm not going to say it's not cost effective, because you can get antifreeze that has greater performance than water, and that might justify its usage. But we use water to cool our locomotives, because they're just that many of them. And if you just think about how many gallons, hundreds of gallons of water that each locomotive takes for its radiators, and we just use water because it's just too expensive to consider proper actual antifreeze or alternatives. So it's like, if we're in a situation where the mainline railroads won't even use proper antifreeze as their radiator fluid, what makes you think that we have enough lithium to go around for all those locomotives? Like the staggering amount of lithium it would take to build a fleet of thousands of battery electric locomotives. Because on average, I think I saw something like a battery electric locomotive, the battery pack in it is like 30 times the size of a Tesla's battery pack, or bigger. It's a lot of lithium, and I think it's silly, because it's it's good money after bad, when really the solution is overhead electrification. I will say that the project that I do appreciate is the Wabtec Flex Drive, because they understand, like, okay, we're not exclusively doing battery electric locomotives. It's the hybrid consist. It's the hybrid concept where, in a lash up of 4 locomotives, you got 3 traditional diesel electrics and 1 Wabtec Flex Drive. And the idea is that locomotive acts as like a buffer. It will harvest energy on the descent or the deceleration, and then deliver that energy on acceleration or climb. I do wonder how if you have a fully charged Wabtec locomotive in a 4-engine consist pulling a mile-long train up from Denver to the Moffat Tunnel, at what point does the Wabtec locomotive say, okay, my battery's spent, sorry guys, have to drop out, hope you guys can handle it? So there's that. And then on the descent, it'll hopefully recharge itself before it gets to Grand Junction. So I like the idea of at least using it as a means to capture some of that energy. Like you burned a lot of diesel to get up here, and on the descent, you've got all this precious, gravitational potential, and it's nice for them to actually use that on the descent, and store it and bank it for using later. So I do appreciate the battery electric concept as a stopgap short-term measure to improve the efficiency on steep grades. But it's a kind of a double-edged sword, because yes, you're going to capture the energy on the way down, but on the way up, halfway up, the battery electric locomotive is going to tap out. And maybe does the entire consist have to slow down at that point? And this might be something where, again, the executives from corporate might say, well, these battery electric locomotives, they're slowing down our trains. They might be more efficient, but, we had to reduce speed by 20% when we got halfway up the hill because the battery electric locomotive dropped out. And then they're like, well, screw this idea. This is dumb. At the same time, this is their choice over proper electrification. But if we did that, say, if most mainline Class 1 railroads electrified that critical 5% of their rail line that uses the most energy, could that stretch the functionality of battery electrics if they were, I don't want to call them dual mode battery electrics, but battery electric locomotives that are capable of in-motion charging? That seems like that would be a good combination there, because I'm not saying like we're doing 5% is not enough electrification to jump from section to section, because that 5% is probably going to be on the steepest grades and maybe out of the busiest freight terminals where you need that booster to kind of get you up to mainline track speed. But, if you were to, say, electrify that 5% on your steepest grades, and then you made sure that every single locomotive in that consist had a battery electric locomotive with it, so that way when you're climbing out of Denver, you have overhead wires that can basically ensure that battery electric locomotive is fully charged. I mean, who knows if it left the depot from, like, say it's a train that came from Kansas, and with a battery electric locomotive in the consist that's just kind of acting as the regenerative brake for the consist. So say it rolls into the depot in Denver at 50% charge. Are they going to charge it there? Are they not going to? Or are they just going to fire up the consist again and continue heading west? And now they get under the wires, and by the time they get to the top of Moffat Tunnel, that battery electric locomotive is fully charged and has been delivering power the entire climb. And on the descent, it doesn't really need a regen to charge its battery. It'll regen to send power into the grid. But now once you get out from underneath the wires, as you continue westward towards Grand Junction, well, you've got a fully charged battery electric locomotive that is waiting in the wings to deliver whatever it can. So, because we know those battery electric locomotives will be struggling on the steepest, sharpest grades. So that's where a battery electric locomotive won't really last long. So if it's already electrified with overhead wires, well, in that case, you're doing in-motion charging over the section of track that would drain your battery electric locomotive the fastest. And I like to think that there is an advantage to be gained there. I still think battery electric locomotives are a very silly idea for the most part. I think that the only place where battery electric locomotives truly are superior to overhead electrification is for shunting services, basically working as the yard goat. I think that that is very important because if you look at a modern freight yard where for some reason we don't use hump yards anymore, well, we used to use a lot more of them. There are still some places where we use hump yards, but hump yards were very, very efficient because basically gravity did the shunting, and you could build trains very easily that way. But again, because fuel was cheap and hump yards took up a lot of real estate, well, guess what the corporate executives tried to do the moment diesel dropped by like a quarter a gallon? Well, no more hump yards. Everything's going to be a flat yard. Everything's going to have moves with the yard goat, which is just the shunting engine. They're not going very fast. They're not going very far, and arguably at any given time they're not hauling that many cars. So if you are in a flat rail yard, then it probably makes the most sense to use a battery electric locomotive there because, again, not going very fast, not going very far, and the charging station is always close by. And you just bring your locomotive over and plug it in, and then take the next one out. That hopefully, you'd have two of them in rotation, maybe two or three in rotation. And given that most large freight yards are very, very close to urban centers because that's where the commerce is and that's where the factories and warehouses are, well, you can also make the environmental health argument of like, well, now we don't have a bunch of diesels, spitting out fumes in the local rail yard, running cars back and forth. Now it's a quiet battery electric shunter. Because if you were to do overhead electrification in a yard, it's very quickly becomes quite the rat's nest. And that's the one place where I look at the corporate executives and be like, yeah, you're probably right. That's probably more trouble than it's worth. Just throw a battery electric locomotive in the yard. But when it comes to the main lines where you're really delivering a lot of power, then it makes sense to do that overhead electrification. Just bite the bullet and go ahead and start doing it. So this 5% of electrification is kind of like the what 5% of electrification can we do that has the greatest benefit to the entire system? And then maybe you start to plant the seed in their head, like, oh, maybe electrification isn't such a bad thing. Maybe we should go from 5% to 6%, then 6% to 8%, 8% to 10%, and kind of let the idea run away with them. But the idea is, what would it take to get them to do that initial investment for that first 5% and to start taking dual mode locomotives seriously? That's the question. Because once they start to have some of this hardware and some of this infrastructure in place, then you're hoping to put them on the slippery slope of, hey, this is actually a really good idea. Hey, this is working. Hey, this is eliminating half of our biggest rebuilds per year. We're saving money on shop time and parts and components. Our locomotives are lasting longer before we need to completely rip apart the prime mover and rebuild it. That's the argument. That's fundamentally what I'm hitting at. I know I've probably beaten it like a dead horse by now, but I like explaining ideas from like 3 different directions. So I'm headed off in a different direction. It's probably time for me to get off from this podcast. I'm taking this locomotive up to my depot up there. So I hope you enjoyed this. Hope maybe I put some thoughts in your head. The whole point of this podcast is to have a lower barrier to entry way for me to talk about some transit projects and railroad stuff without committing to a full video. I still plan on making my full videos when I have the time. But for right now, I just wanted to kind of have something simple where I can talk about some ideas and have a little bit of a better visual aid in the background to talk over. So without further ado, I hope you guys have a great rest of your week and take care.